Good morning. It's really nice to see so many people here. We're absolutely delighted to have such fantastic speakers here for you to learn from, to gain some knowledge from today. So I don't intend to talk for a huge amount of time. A lot of people in this room are very familiar with me talking at them for periods. So I really just wanted to present on the Churchill Fellowship that I undertook towards the end of last year, which actually being in Australia feels like it was a million miles away now. If you've not heard of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust, it's a fantastic organisation. Basically, if you have a project in mind that you're passionate about and that you want to go and explore further and travel to another country to find out more about, you can apply. And the whole process is very fascinating. There was an interview, you had to detail your project and exactly what would be involved, and you can obviously choose where you want to go to do your research. So aside from the obvious benefits of going to Australia, there were definitely some services that I wanted to explore while I was there. One of the last times that I delivered this presentation was in Edinburgh Zoo, and it was in the room right next to the chimps, so I'm hoping this might be a bit more of a nicer audience than the chimps were, because they screeched through the whole thing, so no screeching please, thanks. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just make a mention about drug-related deaths and the reasons, the sort of main points, I suppose, of where my recommendations from my report were focused. Tell you a bit about the project, exactly what I did for the 6 weeks while I was away. I'm going to talk about supervised injecting and some of the main outcomes from supervised injecting facilities. And some of the myths about what supervised injecting facilities don't do. And then I'm going to invite up another speaker just to add his input, and I'll introduce him at the end to add to the presentation. So when I put the project together, drug-related deaths were at an all-time high. So the drug-related deaths in 2014 had hit a record level of 613 people losing their lives. Tragically, obviously, now we have the figures for 2015, and those numbers are higher again, so 706 people, like Leon just mentioned this morning. I think what I always like to start with, and that I think is really important that we remember, is that these are overdose deaths only. So they're not deaths from bloodborne viruses, bacterial infections, road traffic accidents, violence, anything else to do with drug use. These are purely overdose deaths, which on the whole means that they're accidental and therefore preventable, which is an absolutely shocking and appalling statistic, really. So the three main points that focused my project were the fact that older drug users are at higher risk of overdose. And when we talk about older drug users, we're talking about people aged 35 plus, which is by no matter of means old. Certainly don't count myself in the old bracket. But if you have a potentially 15 to 20 year history of injecting drug use, your age can certainly be, that ageing process is definitely affected. So we talk about older drug users being at higher risk, and the average age of a drug-related death in Scotland now being 41. Witnesses are generally present when somebody dies, so it's mainly other people who are using, but sometimes family members, friends, it's sometimes staff and services. So it's so important as well that we're aware of the signs and symptoms of an overdose and that we act quickly. And treatment is a protective factor. Treatment is a protective factor. So a lot of the time in Scotland, we find that some of our services have a very punitive approach. This is something that causes a lot of controversy a lot of the time when I'm in training and delivering on this subject and talking about this in particular. We know that you're much safer, your risks of an overdose death are much lower when you're on protective treatment. So I do not understand why we have in some services a system where people can be readily discharged for not attending appointments or deeming to not comply with the service's expectations. So these are the three main points, I suppose, from my report. So just to give you a bit of the structure about how it actually took place. So I did a lot of preparatory work before I actually left. As I say, despite Australia being Australia, I also had some really good contacts there. So I had already met Marianne and Jauncey at a conference in Basel in Switzerland. And I remember sitting around the breakfast table at the hotel we were staying and saying, oh, I'd love to come and visit you one day in Sydney and come and see the injecting centre, and then never actually thought it would happen. So I'd already met Marianne, and I had also already met Professor Paul Dietz in Australia because of the naloxone connection, and I had been involved in the World Health Organisation guidelines on opioid overdose. So I knew that with having these two really good contacts, they would be able to link me in with other people and direct me to relevant services that I would be able to visit, and they were extremely helpful in that respect. Then I very quickly produced just a very brief survey monkey, so I imagine that there's people in this room that completed that survey, so thanks very much to you if you did. It was only live for a couple of weeks, and it was basically an opinion survey on drug consumption rooms for Scotland. It was live for 2 weeks. 428 people responded to it, which was pretty good. I was very impressed, and it just showed, you know, the willingness to have that conversation about the subject. The main points from the survey that came up were that the majority of people supported drug consumption rooms for Scotland, and the majority of people felt that Glasgow would be most in need of the service. So this survey really prompted and led the conversations that I then went on to have with key stakeholders in Scotland. So public health people, people in Health Protection Scotland, police, people in Scottish Government, politicians, ministers, lots of different people I had the conversation with. Showed them the results of the survey, told them about my trip, and asked if they would have any specific questions for me to bring back. So I felt it was really important to include people's opinions at the start of the project as well and be able to do that feedback on return. I also spent some time with John Campbell from Glasgow, who took me around some of the public injecting sites in Glasgow city centre. For me, and you know, possibly being a bit naive, obviously talking a lot about public injecting, but never having been up close and personal with any public injecting sites, it was really quite confronting. And certainly this was just a stone's throw away from the main shops, businesses, etc. And it was horrible conditions that day. It was wet. The environment was just pretty awful. I mean, loads of discarded injecting equipment. It was estimated there were maybe a couple hundred people using this site, and it had only been there for a couple of months. So pretty dehumanising, very unsafe, and certainly not anywhere that you would want a family member of yours using drugs if they had the choice. So the journey that I took was a bit all over the place, just to purely fit in with conferences, because we have a world-leading national naloxone programme, which many of you are involved in. It was really nice to be able to give some of that back. So whenever I was travelling around different areas, people were really keen for me to speak about the naloxone programme, which I was more than happy to do. So in Melbourne, the Centre for Research Excellence on Injecting Drug Use held a seminar looking at prison healthcare and prison naloxone programmes. So I was able to present on our prisons programme at that, and it was very well received. And then also in Melbourne, spent some time visiting lots of different services and having meetings with different professionals and stakeholders, and I had a meeting with Justice Health to look at how they were going to try and implement naloxone in their prisons, which they weren't doing at the time. One of the things that I did spot in Melbourne just straight away was the prevalence of sharps bins everywhere around the city, which I thought was quite inspiring, which we don't ever see anywhere around about here, but they were in every public toilet I went into. They were on signposts, lampposts around the city, and it was quite nice to see that provision for people. Then went off to the International Harm Reduction Conference in Malaysia and presented again there on the Scottish programme. It was a fascinating event over a few days with up to 1,000 people from all over the world talking about different harm reduction strategies. And then it was back to Sydney, and I spent 2 full weeks in the medically supervised injecting centre, and I got fully involved in the daily business of the centre, and it was probably the most worthwhile experience of my whole trip. I'm not going to go into the detail of the centre, obviously, because we have the expert here to do that for us. But during my time there, I nipped out and met with key people that had been involved in the setup of the centre and that were still currently involved. So I met with police and politicians, the judge who was involved in assisting with the legislation, lots of different people, and gave me a really good insight into some of the practicalities, issues issues and challenges for setting up a service here. And then I went off to Perth, and I was invited to the Australasian Professional Society on Alcohol and Other Drugs, a very researchy based conference, so for those of you that like a graph, you would like that one. I did a workshop on naloxone on a Sunday morning, dedication for you, and then I did a presentation at one of the parallel sessions. So again, lots of interest in what we're doing here in Scotland with naloxone. It's really, really worthwhile. So following the trip, I had to put together a report. The report was published on the Churchill Fellowship website, and it comes with 3 main recommendations that I picked up from my travels. So the main one being supervised injecting facilities. So wherever there are significant numbers of people injecting in public, there are a clear need for supervised injecting facilities. Take-home naloxone, obviously. Take-home naloxone should be available free of charge and promoted widely to those most likely to witness an overdose. We're currently facing challenges with different funding changes to the naloxone programme here. It's so important that we don't get complacent with the programme. Whilst it's not the only thing that's going to reduce drug-related deaths, it's certainly something that should still be prioritised, and it should still be widely available. It should still be top of your mind when you're seeing people, is this person actually carrying naloxone? So anyone likely to witness an overdose can now access it. And the third one is about active engagement and retention in treatment services, and that low threshold services should be widely available across the country. So we should have quick access to treatment on the same day that somebody presents. We should also have very little occasions when people are being taken off of life-saving prescribing treatment. And I think I harped on enough about that at the start. So, just to make a mention then of supervised injecting facilities, so these are not new. So supervised injecting facilities have been around for many, many years, for 30 years now, the first one being in Switzerland. There's around 90 across the whole across the world, with some countries having, multiple services available to people. Their main outcomes are to reach as much of the target population as possible. So I think for me, that was one of the main things I got from the Sydney experience, was about this contact that you were able to get with some of the most marginalised and vulnerable people, because you weren't being seen as a health service. Although it was very much a health service, that's not how it was being seen as the people accessing the service. So they felt very comfortable to actually come to the service and not be judged. So you're reaching a huge population that traditional services find really challenging to meet. To provide a safe environment that enables lower risk, more hygienic drug injecting. So of course the equipment's all sterile, people have access to as much sterile equipment as they need. The whole environment is sterile. You're certainly not sitting under a bush in the freezing cold, in the rain, surrounded by discarded injecting equipment. Of course, it's about reducing morbidity and mortality also, and one of the most prevalent statistics is that there have been 0 overdose fatalities in any supervised injecting facility anywhere in the world ever. So not one person has died from an overdose in the 30 years that these facilities have been operating. You're stabilising and promoting the health of service users. The evidence shows that the more times somebody accesses a service, the more likely they are then to go on and access other health services, such as treatment, but also wound care, and all the other health promotion things that we would want to introduce for people. And of course to reduce public drug use and associated nuisance. So Marianne will be able to give you figures on how Sydney has tackled that as well. So what do injecting facilities not do? Well, they don't encourage increased drug use or initiate new users. There's absolutely no evidence to support that. They don't perpetuate drug use by providing people with better conditions. They certainly don't undermine treatment goals. And they don't attract drug users or dealers to the area, so this honeypot effect that's often described. So injecting facilities are placed in an area where people are already going to deal drugs or to use drugs. So it doesn't have that honeypot effect. And the main thing really is that if we're providing people with sterile injecting equipment, then we should be providing them with a sterile environment in which to use. So I'm now going, there were two main people that contributed to my report as well. So one of them unfortunately couldn't be here today, Caroline, who tragically lost her son to an overdose. She contributed her whole story to my report, and I'm very thankful to her for doing that, and very sad that she can't be here today, but she's in demand because she's presenting at another conference. And we also had Andrew, who is actually down from my neck of the woods in the Scottish borders, and funnily enough once went to Sydney and actually used the medically supervised injection centre. So I'm glad to say that he's here today, and I'll just invite you up, Andrew, to tell us about your experience of using the service. Thank you.
Hello. Looking good today. Basically just what Kirsten was saying there. I went to Sydney. I'm a joiner to trade, and I was staying in a hostel in Randwick. I got friendly with an addict called Mark, and he was a nice guy. He was a Maori. He was a big lad. And King's Cross at that time had a problem with drugs. There was a big royal commission. Basically, before they had the site there, I was led to believe that, believe it or not, the police were actually sort of dealing most of the drugs and everything. There was a royal commission, and things changed, and then they eventually got the site, the sterile site, up and running. And I know now why Mark went there and why I went there. It was because it was safe. It was a safe place where he could go. And he knew that if the heroin was potent, there was somebody there to bring him back round. And also, I think, for people that were jagging for going into their grounds and all this kind of thing, again, you've got people there that can take your shares, have a look at that. And, it was my opinion of the place, it was really... It was really good, really clean, really friendly service. I mean, King's Cross was bad, and I think it was badly needed. So it was good of Australia, to actually start it off. So really, that's really all I've got to say to you. Is like that's me. Thank you.